Wait, Swamiji. No. Yes.
I want to welcome everyone back to this afternoon's, or this part 2 of this morning's session. There's been a request to give a best attempt from our end to talk a little bit about tomorrow with respect to the Dalai Lama's talk. So I'm just going to briefly try to give you what we know on our end. For starters, it should be made clear that the Festival of Faith is not the host for the Dalai Lama. We are the happy, well, we're just happy to be next to the host of the Dalai Lama. And we are actually going to have a relationship to the program tomorrow, but it's by the invitation of the hosts, which is the Drepon Gomang Institute here in Louisville. So what you should know is if you have really specific things that you want to double confirm after I tell you what I'm about to tell you, you should look at their website. And if you've got a pencil, it's a pretty easy one to remember. If you don't, it's DalaiLamaLouisville.org. So that's really the authority, not me. But here's what I know. Our program here, which will be our final program tomorrow morning, starts at 10 a.m. and will end promptly at 11:30. Thank you, Elizabeth and Deng Sila, for your willingness to be with us then. The doors for the Dalai Lama at the Yum Center open at 11, so a half an hour before our program ends. The State Department is running all of the security, and we have been told it is going to be the highest security that they've maybe ever had, especially after the Boston activity, that it's really going to be extremely tight security. And so they just, want everybody to know that in advance. And of course, like the idea, this is the State Department, likes the idea of everybody coming on the early side so it can help them get through whatever we're going to encounter on the security side. And it's been said that it could be up to an hour or even more to get in. I don't think we should panic, however. For those of you that have seen the Dalai Lama before, you'll know often there is what I'll just call, for lack of a better word, a pre-show. That's a thing. It's a real thing, But it's the house lights maybe are on, but meanwhile there's stuff going on stage, which is there to entertain, engage, and connect with us. But that's not the Dalai Lama himself. But the pre-show is supposed to start at around 12:30. Or otherwise known as the program. And then, apparently, at around 1:30, His Holiness will come on the stage, and actually that our relationship, meaning the Festival of Faith relationship, at the invitation of DGI to connect with His Holiness, will occur at that time, at 1:30. And I think that about sums it up. If you have any more questions, again, I would just go right to the Dalai Lama Louisville website, and of course we'll be around, and we can be helpful today and tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Welcome back, and we're delighted to welcome Rabbi Arthur Green to our panel. He's the Irving, and this is when I'm inspired by, she's not here, great. It's my turn to stumble at the Brudnick Professor of Jewish Philosophy and Religion at Hebrew College, where he's also Dean and Rector of the Rabbinical School. Rabbi Green has long been recognized as the world's most preeminent authority on Jewish thought and spirituality. A prolific author, his recent books have included Radical Judaism and a revised edition of his Jewish vocabulary, These Are the Words. His interest in the mystical tradition has inspired his works such as Seek My Face, Speak My Name, a contemporary Jewish theology, and a Kabbalah for Tomorrow. Rabbi Green's translations and interpretations of teachings are also reflective of his deep and abiding interest in Jewish mysticism. Welcome to the panel. I also have a firm sort of instruction from my boss, Mustafa, that this session must conclude in exactly 60 minutes because for a brief lunch break and a very important session after that with the Dalai Lama fellows, young scholars and spiritual aspirants who are doing very remarkable work. So quickly down to the program. Father Richard will speak next, and he is globally recognized as a preeminent ecumenical teacher bearing witness to the universal awakening within mystical and transformational traditions, a Franciscan priest of the New Mexico province and founder of the Center for Action and Contemplation in Albuquerque, New Mexico, home of the Rohr Institute. His teaching is grounded in practices of contemplation, expressing itself in radical compassion, particularly for the socially marginalized. So in keeping with our tradition here, a moment's silence, sir, before you speak.
Okay, I'd like to start with this, that it's strange to me that the religion that believes the Word became flesh has become so wordy that it's been much of its history has been fighting about words, using words in different ways, defining words, defending words. And I myself have struggled with that. You'd think we would have been much more concerned for what we call incarnation, enfleshment, the physical world. If we believed what we said we believed, that God became incarnate in this Jewish man called Jesus. That's the belief of the Christian tradition. So you'd think our focus would have been on incarnation, enfleshment, but it hasn't been. We returned the compliment and the flesh became word again. And nothing against words, but we've been very wordy. And I wanted to start with that since our theme here is supposed to be silence. I'm going to talk a little theological. Please don't be put off by it. But, you know, they say you got to know the rules before you can know how to break the rules. So I'm going to begin with something that is quite orthodox, supremely orthodox in Christian tradition, and that would be, of all things, the doctrine of what we call the Trinity. That the shape of God in Orthodox Christian belief is that God is much more a verb than a noun. God is a relationship. God is a communion between those that we gave them masculine names largely, although we argue about whether the Holy Spirit was feminine. But as Cynthia Bourgeot, a woman teacher I teach with, she says, don't go there. She says, we women still lose. There's the Father and the Son, and it's 2-1, you know. So she said, don't argue about whether they're all masculine, whether they're all feminine. It misses the point. The important thing is the relationship between them, not the names of the so-called three persons. But it says that God is a verb more than a noun. God is a relationship. God is a communion. But what happened is we pulled what we believed was the incarnate one, the visible one, out of this process of communion, of relationship, which cannot be talked about. Would have given us much more patience with silence, but we wanted something to talk about. And so the visible one became the one we talked about. To put it very honestly, and I hope this doesn't offend the Christians, but I think we overplayed the Jesus card. And we pulled Jesus out of this dynamic union. And then we had not just overplay it, but over-describe it and over-defend it. But let's go to some language that I bet most of us here could share. We might use different vocabulary. But we said, and I know we used masculine words. That's a historical accident, perhaps. But again, don't get lost in the words. Well, the word Father is the formless one, the source. It was Yahweh, the God of Israel. It was the God that our Jewish ancestors had discovered and reverenced and was beyond words, could not be spoken of. In fact, that's why they didn't use the sacred name. It was unspeakable, which our Jewish ancestors gave us just a marvelous sense of humility before God and non-talkativeness. To use this name was to use it in vain. You don't know what you're talking about. But then we said this Father, Christian belief is, took form. The formless one took form because we had to see one we could love and relate to, the I-thou relationship that humans seem to need to often fall in love with God. That was the Christian belief. And then the one we called the Holy Spirit was precisely the love relationship between the two, which again could not be named, described. The best we could do is come up with metaphors like a descending dove, a fire, a wind, flowing water, all dynamic words, but metaphors, clearly metaphors. And we forgot that the language of religion, I think the only possible language of religion, is metaphor. And that comes as a great shock to most Christians, that every word we use is metaphorical. It's like, it's like, it's like, it's like. And if we would have been more honest and accepted the Jewish commandment that any name is vain, and cannot be talked rightly, is not a perfect or adequate description, I think we would have had much more humility around words. But if we would have honored the Father and the Holy Spirit, instead of, as I said, and I don't mean to be irreverent, but overplaying the Jesus card, which also had the sad effect of putting us in competition with the other world religions. Because we had to prove Jesus, 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 Jesus. And he was pulled out of the very union that he talked about, that he taught us. That's the irony of it, that we ended up not being faithful to our own tradition. So what we see happening when we not only overplay the Jesus card, but we make Jesus the new founder of our new religion, who died, I think, a happy Jew. I don't think he knew he was founding, certainly not the Roman Catholic Church, right? He never heard of it, and that's not irreverent. I'm still one of them, But you learn to recognize that we've understood these things outside of any honest historical context. And so what happens is very soon then, we not only separate from our roots of Judaism, but we align ourselves with the Roman Empire. And that's why it's called Roman Catholicism, right? That we got aligned with power and war and money and Europe. And that had some good aspects. I'm not saying they're all bad, but it made it, again, necessary to defend, to prove our God. Our God's better than your God. So this humble Jewish man, Jesus, becomes this theocratic figure, as you see in much European art, sitting on a throne, throwing thunderbolts down. The very Latin word, I was forced to learn Latin, Deus, for God, is really a form of Zeus. I don't know if you know that, but we were basically dealing with a pagan notion of God. And this became Jesus, who pretty soon had nothing to do with Jesus anymore, hardly at all, simply the available God figure to hold the Roman Empire together. Now, there were always people who went to the deeper level, what I call the underground stream, and who found the mystical root, the unspeakable. What happens shortly after 313, when Constantine makes us the established religion of the Roman Empire, and we join the powers that be, which seems to me prostitutes an awful lot of Jesus' message, we will see the birth of what we call the Desert Fathers and Mothers, moving into Egypt, Syria, Cappadocia, Eastern Turkey, Palestine. And this is where the mystical tradition developed, where the contemplative life was discovered and taught, that we needed a different mind to comprehend such high-level teaching, that the normal, what I called earlier, dualistic mind can't get you there. It's too inadequate to understand when Jesus says, the Father and I are one. And we are giving you our Holy Spirit. We are giving you our relationship. You can't understand this new principle of three with the old principle of two, of dualistic, which is always antagonistic, either or, right or wrong, kind of thinking. And this continued in Roman Catholicism throughout the centuries, which created the two-level Christianity that Luther rightly reacted against. All these monks and friars and nuns, and I'm not saying they were all contemplatives, but have no doubt that at the heart of every religious community, like my own Franciscan community, was the rediscovery of the contemplative mind. And that's why so many of us became hermits, and you had to move apart from normal society and the chatter we were talking about to learn how to think again, to learn how to see again. But unfortunately, it did create this two-level society, and the normal Catholic in the normal church in Florence or Heidelberg or Paris really wasn't expected to learn that. He just, forgive my cynicism, he or she was just taught to pay, pray, and obey, all right? But the pray didn't really mean contemplative prayer. It was saying prayers, usually with a dualistic mind. So the marvel of living in our time is that this is being retrieved and named honestly, that we had it, we lost it, we continually rediscovered it, but always marginalized it, off to the edge, that it wasn't expected for the ordinary Christian believer. Then, thank God for the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, because we were the only game in town. We had a monopoly on supposed Christianity, at least in the West. And without prophetic thinking, again, which we learned from the Jews, self-critical thinking, all religion, in my opinion, becomes idolatrous, becomes self-serving. And so the Reformation tried to reform us, but I have to say, after saying that, largely, it was not a recovery of the contemplative tradition. It wasn't. It became even more heady, even more verbal, even more argumentative than we were. And again, it had to happen, but now we're at the end of 5 centuries of endless Christian argumentation, which the world is just tired of. It doesn't listen to us anymore. It doesn't take us seriously. Each group claiming it's the only one that Jesus loves, and revealing little mystical dynamic Trinitarian flow of life between us or within us or around us. And so naturally and rightfully, I think we find ourselves in a very defensive position today, because what the world says, the secular West says, is show us the fruit. Show us the fruit. Where did the 2 world wars come from? They didn't come from pagan Asia, so as we thought of it, but the little continent that we Christians thought we had in the bag. We were all Catholics and Christians in that little part of the world called Europe. And that's where it happened. That's where the Holocaust happened. I mean, the irony of that. It's like killing your grandfather, But when you separate from your grandfather, our Jewish heritage, and you don't know that that is your grandfather or your father, however you want to call it, you end up instead killing the ones you should honor and love. That will stand forever, forever, as a massive judgment on the immaturity of Western Christianity, that was not seen, that was not recognized, and that was not stopped, but even allowed at the highest levels. So, but I think, and here's what I'll try to just bring it together on. I'm not a historian really, and I don't want to be overly critical or negative. There's no point in that at this point. But I think when you lose the contemplative mind, the non-dual consciousness, and for me they're the same thing, you invariably create violent people. The argumentative dualistic mind is endlessly argumentative. And we created an argumentative continent, which we exported here to North America. We see it in our politics. We see it in our church inability to create what you've created here so beautifully in Louisville, that most cities don't have an interfaith conference, I'm sorry to say. The Baptists are still fighting the Lutherans and the Catholics, and we're fighting them. What a waste of time, huh? But what you'll notice, and I'm going to return to my initial point, that you don't see in any of these any great knowledge of God as a verb instead of a noun. That we say the doctrine of Trinity is the absolute foundational theology of Christianity. Yet, as Karl Rahner, the German Jesuit, said back in the early 60s, he said, we could drop the doctrine of the Trinity tomorrow, and it would leave 99% of most Christian life and practice virtually untouched. Because we haven't unfolded at that level. My connection with our theme is that a Trinitarian God is much more a mystical experience. It invites, in fact, it necessitates non-dual consciousness. I'm not saying, obviously, to my brothers and sisters from other religions that they have to believe in the Trinity, but we've come at this mystery of God as a dynamic flow, God as communion, God as relationship. We've all used different language to find it. But that was the Christian vocabulary. That was the Christian metaphor. But what I'm saying here is we didn't understand or honor or develop or unpackage our own metaphor for the nature of God. And we ended up creating a God in Jesus, a God image, who was in competition with the other world religions. Simone Weil, that marvelous French woman who stood on the edge of Christianity her whole life, between Judaism and Christianity, wanting her very life to be a bridge, loving both of them and not being able to choose either of them. She said that the trouble with Christianity is that it has made itself into a separate religion instead of recognizing that the message of Jesus, the prophetic message of Jesus, might just be necessary for the reform of all religions. That was her great message itself. but we made ourselves into a competition. And once we were in competition, we were verbal, we were aggressive, we were antagonistic, and saddest of all, we were violent. Because I think one follows from the other. And yet, I can't doubt and deny, because I was lucky enough to be exposed to it as a Franciscan, that the deeper stream was always there. The stream of contemplation, of quiet, of letting go, of renunciation, of non-dual thinking, which we called contemplation or unitive consciousness. But it was never, I must admit, the mainstream. And we've just got to be honest about that now, that it was relegated to a minority position. And so when you tell most Christians about it today, maybe some of you are thinking it, I hope not, but it sounds heretical. Or where's he coming from? It's because I'm traditional that I end up looking liberal. Isn't that strange? Well, it isn't strange at all. In fact, I bet all my brothers and sisters here would say the same thing. When you know the tradition with the big T, the Judeo-Christian perennial tradition, and you discover the deeper stream, it's just so easy to sit on a stage with brothers and sisters like this, because I know we can talk from a common base. And I'll be honest with you, it's much easier to sit up here than with most Catholic priests, if they were who would probably think I'm a heretic. And I was trained in Orthodoxy. I was trained in Catholic Orthodox traditional theology, but the whole tradition, the whole Judeo-Christian tradition, which taught me to honor the visibility and the revelation of God in all of the world traditions. So our school in Albuquerque, that's what we're going to start with this September, is simply reintroducing the West to what we call the perennial tradition, the underground stream that we all share. And that does not mean, and I will stop on this, that you have to abandon. I would not encourage you to abandon your own mother tradition. You got to go deep in one place. You got to find how to surrender to one God before you, as the first commandment said. And I think that's absolutely right. And when you go deep in one place, you fall in to the underground stream, which clearly I think we all share. And finally, of course, at that place, silence is much more possible. Because you know that all words are inadequate, all words are faulty, all words are yes, but. And I think if we could surround our religions with that kind of humility, with that kind of patience, we all would find this kind of conversation entirely easy and entirely natural. So I just thank you for making it possible and for inviting me to be a part of it. Thank you.
I can't help but feel, Father, Richard, that you're unduly harsh on your faith. As I mentioned before the break, that I think when we look at all our traditions, the metaphysical aspiration is essentially a fringe aspiration.
Of all, huh?
Of all traditions.
Well, that's good to hear,
I guess.
But I hear you, yeah.
And also that, turning to His Holiness, that he has had deep admiration, for the Christian tradition, and particularly for the tradition of service, of compassion, of reaching out to help people. And he so often talks about how that is something that Tibetan monks and Tibetan monasteries should look out for and learn from.
That's good to hear.
And I think that's, and having said that, sort of when I rushed to the restroom after the break, I overheard conversation and said, why don't they talk about prayer? Why don't they talk about action, sort of manifesting compassion in action? And I think that the Vedantic and the Eastern traditions have thought hard about different mental dispositions and how you pursue the path of action and moving away from mysticism, if that is your mental disposition and your proclivity. And it's called karma yoga, that you perform actions in a manner that of dispassionate action, distancing yourself from the fruits of action that enable you to perform right action. And His Holiness would, in Tibetan vocabulary, would talk about motivation, the importance of motivation in the actions that you perform. The question is that you spoke about, God is relationship, and the value of relationships, the value of community in being able to nurture silence. And I think the rabbi could perhaps talk about the notion of the Sabbath, of a community of silence. Yes. So in Buddhism we have Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and the great importance of the Sangha of having a community that enables and empowers the cultivation of silence. So would you share that with us?
Thank you. They indeed wanted to let me be silent today. Today is our Sabbath, and so I said, well, yes, I don't want to do too much, but the fate of rabbis is that while everybody else is supposed to rest on the Sabbath, we wind up working on the Sabbath. So I taught a class at the temple this morning, and now I'm here, and I spoke there last night, so I seem to be having a very verbal silence this Sabbath. But I want to say a couple of things in response. I agree that flagellation is there in all of our traditions, and we have to be wary of it. We have all much to learn from one another, and those of us in the Jewish tradition who respect the contemplative aspect of our tradition and the mystical aspect are very grateful to the Catholic Church for having preserved so much of that mystical tradition for many, many years. It happened to me in my life, I must tell you. The first book I wrote was a little book. It was Hasidic instructions on prayer. And a friend and I translated the book, and we sent it to various Jewish publishers for several years, and they said, nobody's interested in this stuff. Nobody wants it anymore. We don't publish prayer books. It wasn't a prayer book. We don't publish prayer books. And then I got a call from the Paulist Fathers, from the Paulist Press, saying, we're doing a series on the spiritual masters. Do you know a Jewish text that we could publish? And I said, yes, it's right in my desk drawer. And since then, I've been involved with the Paulist Fathers in a wonderful, wonderful series. They've done the classics of Western spirituality, and they've done a tremendous service to all of us in presenting and preserving spiritual traditions. So I think we have to acknowledge that. I want to say two more words, things I want to mention. God is a verb. The word G-O-D is a pox. It's a pox on us, because as soon as we pronounce that G-O-D word, the old fellow in the sky comes popping up. So let's say, yes, remember verb, the Hebrew name for God, which I still do not pronounce, but which is transcribed in English as YHWH. You can pronounce it your own way. YHWH, if I had my blackboard here, I would show you, is an impossible conflation of the verb to be. Haya is was, and hoeh is the present, and yihyeh is the future. And you take past, present, and future all together and put them in a form that doesn't exist, and you get yud, hey, wow, hey. You get the name of God. It really should be translated not G-O-D, but is, was, will be. Is, was, will be, all at once. But you can't say that, of course. You can't say that. And so we substitute for it some substitution. Lord, the name, something that protects it, because it's too holy to be spoken by mere mortals like us. But when Moses is going down into Egypt, you remember, God reveals the name to him, and then he says, if the people ask me, what are you called? What shall you say? And he says, I am that I am, or I shall be what I shall be, which I think means I am really a verb. Here is my name. But if you think that name is a noun, which is to say, if you can put me in a little box and say, I have God, I will be what I will be. I will go conjugate myself and become a verb again. I will fly away and be a verb again. I will be a verb, which is to say, I am the one you can't catch. I am the ultimately inaccessible one. Of course, Trinitarianism is not our problem, is not our language. When I gave a series of lectures at a synagogue where one of our rabbis, we train rabbis in Boston, and we have wonderful graduates. One of them had me come speak, and he made up a poster for the occasion, which I now have on my door as you come to see me. And the poster says, "Is there only one God, or is there only one?" And I think that's the conversation we in some ways should be having, the East-West conversation. What is the meeting point between our Western monotheism and the monism that underlies so much of Eastern religion, and that you and I seem to know, and we all seem to know, is there in our contemplative traditions as well? How do we build the bridge between a monotheistic language, which we, on this end of the table, we three Westerners have inherited, and the truth that we know lies behind it, the truth that there is only one? That, I think, is part of what should be on our table, and that has something to do with the legacy of violence and competition also. Because as long as there is only one God, then it's my God and not yours. When there is only one, there's not much competition to talk about anymore.
I'm going to invite Dr. Syed Hussein Nasser to make a presentation.
I don't have just a few moments, and I could talk for hours about what has just been said. What my very dear, very close friend Arthur Green said about the relationship between what's called Oriental monism. I've never used this term, and monotheism is a very crucial point, but I myself have written humbly for 50 years about this subject, and it's been thought about and written about by many important figures, and it's an important subject to come back to, of course, the meeting of the Abrahamic and Indian Far Eastern worlds as far as this metaphysics is concerned. But I want to come back to make two comments on something which is crucial for the understanding between various religions. One is that God is the verb, and one is that the Trinity is the supreme reality. And I speak here as both a humble student of religions and as a Muslim who knows a little bit about Islamic thought. A verb is always in time. A verb implies time. And to say that God is a verb is to temporalize God. And so God cannot be verb in the ordinary sense. In the same way that God can be referred to as every pronoun, as I, as thou, as he, she, and so forth and so on. In the same way, God transcends all parts of speech and includes all parts of speech. But he cannot be reduced to one part of speech. That is metaphysically absurd. Secondly, Trinitarianism or Trinity implies relationality. Relationality implies relativity. And if God is only relation, then he's no longer absolute. And absoluteness is taken away from the divine principle, something which no Hindu metaphysician from Shankara down would ever accept. Why are you shaking your head? He would accept? Anyway, I'm talking from my own tradition, and I think the great authority in Jewish thought of Maimonides or anybody else would say that God cannot be relative in the absolute. The absolute cannot be relative. And if there is no absolute, then relativity itself ceases to have meaning in relation to something beyond itself. And we are purely in the realm of relativity, and what is the use of religion anyway? So this very profound comments that he made, I understand where he's coming from, the father, Franciscan father, it's very important comments. Must be, I think, formulated another way. A lot of Christian theologians will now talk about God being relation. But if it's only relation, the stasis, God as being, is denied, and we no longer have the metaphysics upon which to speak in a serious manner about the divinity in relation to us. And certainly the Islamic tradition, all of its different schools, Sufi and philosophical schools, stand against this thesis, while understanding that God is also al-Hayy, his life. So there's divine life. And even within divinity, there is, that's what he's really alluding to, there's divine life. The word al-Hayy and al-Muhyi, that is life and the giver of life, are two divine names mentioned in the Quran. So I, as a humble commentator upon what was said, would add these comments, and I hope one day, of course, with a big audience like this, perhaps it's not feasible, but to get into the more important and profound theological issues, which are changing of the divinity from male to female, or from noun to verb, implies actually for our faith systems.
Well, we've already heard, we've had so many invaluable insights from Dr. Nasser, and if you were here yesterday afternoon, there was an absolutely brilliant articulation from him. So I hesitate to do another formal introduction, but I will stay true to form before he makes his formal presentation. Dr. Nasser is currently Professor of Islamic Studies at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He is one of the most important and foremost scholars of Islamic spirituality, Sufism, and the environment in the world. He's the author of over 50 books and 500 articles which have been translated into several major Islamic, European, and Asian languages. His latest book, The Need for a Sacred Science, deals with the meaning of a science rooted in the sacred, the metaphysical foundation of such science, its contrast to modern science, and its pertinence to some of the major issues facing humanity today. Prasad.
With your permission, I prefer to stand.
Sure.
I'm going against what everybody else did, but I'll have to step back, and it's easier for me. Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Especially now, let me translate in the name of God, the most merciful and compassionate, because I'm going to be speaking about sacred silence and compassion as I was assigned. I only have 20 minutes to speak, and I shall have to summarize, because I want to say some things which were, I think, skipped over in our discussion of the last couple of days, and which I feel are significant if we're going to be honest with ourselves on the subject that we're discussing. But let me begin, first of all, what I alluded to yesterday. I cannot presume that the audience will be the same, and that is that, metaphysically speaking, silence is not metaphor, symbol. I would use the word symbol rather than metaphor. The symbol of the non-manifested and non-creative aspect of the divine principle, what the Kabbalah would call the Insof, what Islam is called that, the divine essence, the Christian Uzya in certain forms of Christian theology, and of course Atman in Hinduism and other traditions. We could go on. And the supreme Tao, which cannot be named, and now the Tao that cannot be named is not the Tao, as the first verse of the Tao Te Ching refers. So we have this silence, which is ultimate reality. And even modern scientific cosmologies, on which I don't base too much value, because every 10 years they change, but for the moment, most of the physicists talk about the Big Bang. What is before the Big Bang? No bang. It's silence. So even that affirms, in a sense, that the bang comes after silence. And I said yesterday, the word of God, in the beginning as the word, or kun fayakun of the Quran, implies a breaking of that primordial silence. And that is why it is sacred silence. It's not to be confused with the ordinary cessation of speech or noise or sound in our world. That is the supernal silence which contains all manifestation. If we can compare the whole of the cosmos to sound, as many Hindu cosmologies do so beautifully, you can say it is a silence that contains all sounds. And on the basis of this, I want to turn to a very important Islamic teaching, which we did not discuss, I have not seen it discussed in this conference yet, which contains, in fact, the relationship between silence and compassion. And that is that the reality of all things was contained in the divine knowledge, in the divine intellect, as possibilities of what we call archetypes. Not in the Jungian sense. Jung did not understand the word about archetypes, but in the metaphysical sense of archetypes, of the ideas in the Platonic sense, in the divine knowledge. And in that state, they had never, these possibilities had not smelled the perfume of existence. As Ibn Arabi says, La shamma ra'ahat al-wujud, these archetypes. And then God breathed upon these archetypes the breath of compassion, nafas ar-Rahman. And through the breath of the compassionate, breathing upon these divine possibilities, which was before the world of existence, all existence came into being. So we are really all, in our substance, the divine compassion. Our very substance, our very existence, according to this cosmology, is nafas ar-Rahman. Ar-Rahman is a divine name meaning the compassionate. It's in Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And so metaphysically, compassion is inseparable from existence. To exist is to swim in the divine compassion. And we exist because God decided to cast his compassion through the breath, nafas, which symbolizes, in fact, the breaking of that primordial silence, in order to existentiate everything that exists. And this everything does not mean only a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian or a Buddhist or a Hindu or an atheist or anybody else. It does not mean only human beings. It does not mean only animals and human beings. It means all of existence. What we call animate and inanimate, which is somewhat of a superficial division, although in profound at a certain level, and conscious and unconscious, which is also a profound division on a certain level, but superficial on others. Certain Hindu cosmologies, everything has a form of consciousness. So embracing everything, embracing all things. And spiritual realization is nothing other than the undoing of this existentiating act, going back from where we came from, and therefore going from sound to silence. And here, the source of sound, which is the sacred silence, made available certain sounds which return us back to silence. As I said in my comment earlier this morning, the divine names of God, certainly in Islam, were not invented by men. They were given by God himself. In the same way that if I have several friends of mine sitting in the first row, I call their name. I say, Gray, she will say yes. Mrs. Henry was sitting right here. In the same way, God has given himself the name Allah in a particular revelation, the Islamic revelation, by virtue of which we say Allah he hears, because he's the all-hearer. It's very symbolic here, significance, how the sacralization of various divine names depends upon the tradition which use those names. So Judaism remains silent about the supreme divine name, as my friend Rabbi Green just said. But in Islam, God chose to give himself the name Allah and the other names that are in the Quran. And by these names, he hears, he responds. And it's very interesting that Arab Christians in the Arab East, in their Eucharistic services, in services, especially Catholics, always use the word Allah for God, for Deus. They don't use Latin. There are many Arabic masses. People do not even parish as one church which has an Arabic mass. That's many Catholics, of course, in Lebanon, other places, Jordan, participate in it. They use the word Allah, but Allah does not have that sacramental efficacy of returning us back to silence among the Christian Arabs as it does for Muslim Arabs, although using the very same word. So the efficacy of sacred names depends upon the sacred universe in which they're made sacred. And every religion has its own means of returning us back to silence. And we use using a symbol of sound because we talk about silence. We talked about mantra this morning, but there are also barks, vehicles for return to silence, which are themselves silent, like the mandala upon which we meditate and contemplate in Hinduism and especially in Tibetan Buddhism, which is so important. And therefore, we cannot limit the means of returning to silence only by sound and sound systems, although this is extremely central and important because it was by the sound that the universe was created. And the method of japa, dhikr, nimbutsu in certain forms of Buddhism, all based on the ejaculatory practice of invocation and prayer, are central actually to the returning of human souls from sound to silence. In Sufism especially, it's not enough to be silent. One must also make a joyful noise unto the Lord, as Christians say, in the form of ejaculatory prayers, and especially the dhikr, the invocation, which is the supreme means of returning us back to our source. But let me come back to compassion. We don't have too much time. Our time is up. I want to bring up some difficult points. First of all, we spoke very little about the truth during the last 2 days. Can there be compassion without truth? No. There's no compassion has any value and spiritually has any efficacy without truth. One can be compassionate for the person who makes error, who is in error. One cannot show compassion for error. That undoes the reality of the spiritual world and ultimately religion itself and the social order. One could argue that one of the most important causes for all of the chaos that we observe in the world today is to separate charity from truthfulness, which unfortunately many Christian thinkers began to do from the 18th, 19th century onward. In the name of being charitable, we accept somebody saying 2 and 2 is 5. The word heresy is now no longer used. It's not in fashion. And the word falsehood is no longer used except in science. Only in the physical science and mathematics, you have falsehood. Nothing else is true and false. Everything is gray. We live in a world of grayness. Part of that is natural to human existence, but part of it is not. In all religions, charity and compassion were always related to truth. And I think that if you're going to do a service for those present and both those who are going to reach this message through all the modern means of communication that are available, the internet or whatever it is, that this be emphasized, that all authentic compassion must be based on the truth. Now, that means also not to keep silent always in the face of error. It's not everybody's vocation to speak against error, but a person who has been given that vocation by God and the capability to do so and remains silent for personal reasons, for selfish reasons, when the truth is negated, is endangering his or her soul of losing not only the virtue of compassion, but ever returning to that sacred silence in peace. It's a very, very serious and important matter. I'm not saying one has to shout every day in the street, but each person, according to his or her knowledge, station, capability, possibility, always faces a situation in which error comes parading as truth. And to just pass it by in order to be charitable is one of, I think, most dangerous errors that the modern world faces. And especially the religions are responsible more than anybody else. Let me start with my own. When people desecrate the tombs of companions of the Prophet, as they did outside of Damascus last week, with money paid by oil-producing countries and supported by this country and England, and nobody in the Islamic world says anything except 10 people, they're as much to blame as the people who did it. And I'm just taking a case of Islam in order not to criticize other religions. But this is unfortunately a fault from which we all suffer. Because I love Hinduism so much, I've been to India so often, it's like my own country. Let me just give one example. When 3,000 Muslims were burned to death in Gujarat a few years ago, the trial is still going on. 3 or 4 of the great Hindu sages said something. The rest all were silent because they were either afraid or for some other reason. And I even read an article published in Delhi criticizing why is it that all these great Hindu sages talk about compassion and so, but nobody's saying anything. And we have this going on over and over again. And this is related also to the separating of compassion from justice. Nobody talks about justice anymore either, unfortunately. God is merciful. He's Ar-Rahman in Islam, but he's also just. There is a justice in the universe. Without justice, nothing prevails. Even the laws of physics are a physical reflection of metaphysical laws of equilibrium and justice. Justice is always related to equilibrium. And you cannot separate compassion from justice in its totality. You cannot be only compassionate about the people in your town, but don't care about the rest of the world. Apply justice only to a small segment of people with whom you're directly related. And this is something which we're all to blame for. All to blame for. It's really a disgrace to be human these days. When all of these people are burned in Burma, the Rohingya Muslims, nobody speaks about it. Nobody speaks about it. It's a very, very good tragedy, terrible tragedy that in Boston, a city which I spent 15 years of my life and studied there and taught there, that this horrible event took place. 3-4 people died, a couple of hundred people were wounded. That's terrible, and the things that were said were all correct. However, every week that passes, with the money paid by taxpayers in this room and elsewhere, dozens and dozens of women and children are killed by drones in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Nobody talks about it. What kind of compassion is this? This kind of compassion cannot have any spiritual efficacy. Compassion must be related to both truth and justice. If it is, then it's a great virtue. But if it's partial compassion, I'm very compassionate about the neighbor down the stairs, but heck with somebody else. And this even applies to the suicide we're committing vis-a-vis the environment. So, or as long as the Ohio River is not polluted, I don't care about Yangtze River and Ganges, they're far away. Who cares about that? But all these waters are interrelated. One day the pollution of the Ganges River is going to kill us as it's killing people in India. And this partial compassion, which is part of the ego about which I spoke yesterday, that only wants to see itself and its immediate interests, is one of the most difficult walls to break, to overcome. But we live in a world, it's not like the Middle Ages where people in France did not know what was going on in Japan. We live in a world in which we have no excuse. Either we must have compassion for all or not to claim to have compassion. Otherwise, we're not fully human. And I really hope and pray that His Holiness, whom I've known for 50 years and was a young man, who said so much about compassion all over the world, his coming here will re-emphasize this for everybody, that compassion is not a partial thing. The Bodhisattva did not take the vow to take his other foot into nirvana until the last blade of grass was saved, only for the grass in his backyard. It was for all grass in the world. And that attitude, which is so strong in the teaching of the Buddha, that compassion is for all creatures, that another way Christ said, love thy enemy. In the Quran, in all sacred scriptures, in Judaism, so many verses of the Old Testament speak about this. We must have a compassion for the whole, otherwise let's stop fooling ourselves. We cannot live in hypocrisy. We cannot live in hypocrisy and claim to be spiritual people. We cannot live in cocoons anymore. This is how God has placed us here on the earth for the moment. That's where we are. Every day we hear what's going on all over the world. Perhaps in older days, people were very fortunate they never heard these things. But now we do hear them. We must be concerned with them. We must be concerned with not only the whole of humanity, but the whole of creation. It includes the whole of the environmental crisis. That compassion has always been for the human species, and not even that, the whole of human species, just our nation, our religion, our people, our neighborhood. We've disregarded compassion for the rest of creation, and here's the result that we see before ourselves. But anyway, in this very difficult period, dark period in which we live, the remarkable miracle is that the holy bark sent by sacred silence to take us back from this noisy world in which we live back to the sacred silence is always there. Happy is he or she who takes advantage of embarking upon this boat and returning to the silence before nature and death silence us beyond our will. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nasser. There seems the desperate need for silence after you have spoken so profoundly and wisely and helped to locate the tradition of metaphysics and metaphysical striving in a very important, valuable dimension, the social context. And I take away from you, it is a disgrace today to be human, and compassion is for all sentient beings. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're headed for silence, but before we do that, if I may just invite each member of our very distinguished and erudite panel from which we have learned so much, both from what you have said and who you are, to give us those final, say, a minute or at the most, very most, 2, and that will test your or confirm your aspiration to ultimate silence, is a few parting thoughts that we can take away with us. I mean, and I apologize to the audience. We should have had time for an interaction with the audience, which was built into the program, but we started about half an hour late, and there is another important program that follows soon after a brief lunch break. So maybe I could start with Matthew, who started the morning for us, a minute or 2.
I think when compassion becomes partial is when we begin to believe that the one for whom we cannot have compassion is intrinsically and forever evil. So if we see with the eye of the physician, then even the worst dictator is someone who is extremely mad, extremely sick, more sick than anyone else. And therefore, if a very mad person comes to see a doctor and has some violent gesture, the doctor is not going to pull out a stick and beat the patient. He will give the strongest possible medication. So in that sense, compassion certainly recognizes and cannot not see, as you said, recognize the sense of justice. At the same time, compassion is not a moral judgment that if you are behaving in this way, you're out of my compassion. So compassion addresses the root of suffering, whatever the suffering can be and wherever it is, and then trying to remedy in every possible way. So in that sense, only it can be englobing. Otherwise, the duality sets in, and there is us and they, there's the good and the bad, and then those who you label as bad, of course, will be outside the realm of your compassion. And just to chime in why duality is the source of violence, because from within this awareness, which is non-dual, if the thought other suddenly as something else comes in, then there's a kind of tremor of fear. What this other has in for me? Is it threatening? Then I want to repulse it. Or is it good for me? Then I crave and I want to attract. And then it's finished. Then you are out of this sense of unity, and therefore, then there will be those who are outside your realm of compassion. So compassion can only arise from this absolute, relative being the word of phenomena, and then it can only embrace all, and then the skillful means is how to make sure that those who commit acts that harms themselves and others will simply get the right medicine for it.
Swamiji.
Yes, I think at this point, perhaps the best I can do is to say something in support of what Matthew just said. That true compassion is something where we become a container large enough to contain the good and the evil in the world, without losing insight. That is, without knowing what is true and what is, without losing the knowledge of what is true and what is false, what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad. But true compassion, what we want to aim for, We don't start with that, but what we want to aim for is to be a container large enough to contain wisdom, insight, that is to know what is true, but also compassion. And when we have both insight and compassion, if we develop, to the extent that we develop both, then we see how everything within the world fits together. Then we won't make the mistakes that Dr. Nasser was referring to, the mistakes of judgment, the mistake of keeping quiet when it is right and necessary to stand up for truth. And so true compassion and wisdom are not, certainly not in the Buddhist tradition, not in the Hindu tradition, and not in any of our traditions, are not really opposed to each other. And let me just end by saying that if we develop compassion truly, if we develop it deeply, then compassion becomes transformative. The idea of compassion is not to say, well, whatever anybody does is all right and let them do it, and I love everybody, and so I don't want to interfere in anything. True compassion is transformative. That is, the person who has deep compassion combined with wisdom, that compassion is by its very nature transformative on the recipients of that compassion. It's not just, compassion is not permissiveness. Compassion is being able to contain and uplift and to illumine with wisdom.
DDG.
First of all, I must say that I feel so honored to be with such scholarly and devoted people. I feel overwhelmed, and I feel very honored. There was a man, a scholar, who went to a saint and said, "Sir, let's talk about God and let's talk about truth and compassion." And they did so for hours and hours. And the entire night passed, and they talked about truth, compassion, and God. And in the early hours of the morning, they finished talking, and the scholar said to the saint, "Our night, Holy Sir, our night was spent so wisely." To which the holy man replied, "Our night was not so well spent after all." And the scholar asked, "Why do you say that, sir?" And he said, "We only talked about God, truth, and compassion. We did not really practice it." The only way that we can imbibe compassion and love for all creatures and regarding all creatures as being equal is to truly retreat in silence and give a lot of our time to contemplation on who am I and what is my relationship with God, and all these wonderful questions need to be asked. And we seem to be so busy in worldly life. There's so much sound, there's so many sounds, so much going on around us that distracts us. So there's such a great need to be silent. Perhaps 2 hours a day, perhaps 1 hour a day. And that spiritual discipline, sadhana as it is called in Hinduism and Buddhism, sadhana, it's in every religion, different semantics are not important, but that sadhana, the practice of spirituality, the practice of loving God, whether we call God Allah or Krishna or Jehovah, it doesn't matter, but that practice of loving Him and shedding tears for Him is so important, and regarding Him as the beloved, and that is going to the root. And unless we go there and unless we speak to God in our silence, we cannot become truly compassionate.
Father Richard.
I think we're in a wonderful position because we are people who believe in prayer, contemplation, to put together things that so often are oppositional. And that's even true of what we're talking about here in terms of truth and love. It reached a high point in the 13th century. The Dominicans said the highest value was truth, and we Franciscans said the highest value was love. And we debated about these things, you know, and clearly the more prayerful ones recognized we were trying to say the same thing, that compassion or love without truth is sentimentality. It really is. And that truth without compassion becomes brutality. And that they've got to finally be one truth, one reality, one disposition. And that the natural habitat, our home base for truth, is human relationships. And I think our mistake was so often to make truth completely conceptual, abstraction, that I could defend it out there, when it's always a truth in a situation, in a relationship, in a context, in a war where suffering is happening. And if the natural habitat for truth is human relationship, I think that's one way of bringing these two together and recognizing they don't need to be oppositional, one or the other. To do the truth in love, I bet, is the philosophy of most of us in this room. Maybe we'd state it in different ways, but that's what we all want to do. And that's, I think, the fruit of prayer.
Dr. Nasser, if you have a
I
word.
think I have nothing more to say, but I also wanted to thank all the participants. I learned a lot from you. And I want to thank the audience. And I hope, as we say in Arabic, inshallah, this meeting will make us both more charitable and compassionate and also more truthful. That's the goal of it.
Final word, Rabbi?
I just joined the conversation, and now having the last word is an awesome responsibility.
That is reserved for me.
Yes, you have. Now I'm relieved. You will have the last word. Yes, compassion has to be for all without limit, but we as survivors of genocide understand that evil has to be fought. Sometimes there is real evil in the world, and one has to stand up against it. And there is a difference between the compassion one has to have for victims and the compassion one has to have for perpetrators. There are distinctions to be made in life. And sadly, history has taught us that. We have to do both. We have to be strong in saying sometimes evil is real, and sometimes evil has to be combated, and not hesitate. And at the same time, we have to be able to go beyond that and say with the psalmist, "V'rachamav kol ma'asav," God's compassion is over all God's works, and that even includes those who have committed the very horrors about which we are, against which we need to stand up. And we need the strength. We need the strength that can come only from God to do both of those and to know how to balance them. It's not easy.
Thank you. I think these words most naturally and wonderfully lead us to the next 3 minutes of silence. But don't run away after that. I have some housekeeping announcements to make. during this period of silence, I couldn't help but reflect and feel deep gratitude for all of our panelists for having given so generously of yourselves and of your insights and of your wisdom. And I know that I speak for several hundred full hearts here. Our deepest gratitude. And I was also thinking about, if I couldn't have silence, I think these are the most wonderful words that have been as enriching for us, or pointing us in the direction of how that silence could be more fruitfully used by us. This marks the close of this part of the morning session. During the afternoon, and I would very strongly recommend that you're back and in your seats by 1:50, is another panel that includes and features the Dalai Lama Fellows, young social entrepreneurs who manifest and who train in social universal responsibility to juxtapose compassion with entrepreneurship and their work. And I think that to look at the young people who embody the aspirations that we have been talking about is an extremely empowering experience. I would very strongly urge and recommend that you're back in your seats by 10 to 2, so it can start punctually at 2 o'clock. Also to flag, in page 31 and 32 of this book tells you more about the Dalai Lama Fellows. There is the Mayor's Governance Dinner tonight at the Gold House. And tomorrow morning, before His Holiness's program, there is pretty much the final concluding program of this particular series of events, a dialogue between mother and son, Elizabeth Namgyal and Dungse Jampel Norbu, at 10 o'clock at the Gold House Hotel. So thank you very much for being such a wonderful patient audience, and I seek indulgence and forgiveness for us running out of time and not being able to give you time and space to ask your questions, and for me hogging that privilege. Thank you for being here.